Well, thank you very much for having me. My name is Francine Pickup. I am the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Policy and Program Support at UNDP. I've been in this job for just over a year now and come to New York, to HQ of UNDP after spending a lot of time working in different country offices and also working for other kinds of organizations as well.
So you basically have a lot of experience in the field. And before coming to this job, you were working in the field. So I guess in the spirit of what Capacity for Dev does, it would be interesting to know what the challenges and the lessons learned were for you when you were working in the field.
So my last three postings before I came to New York were, as the leader of country offices. So I worked in Serbia, in India, and Indonesia most recently. And I think from those experiences, the sort of main thing, three things I think that I learned. And those would be the importance of partnerships, working not just as an organization by ourselves, but really being partner oriented from the outset in everything we do. Number one. Number two is the importance of communications. And number three, the importance of innovation. So when it comes to partnerships, I think we can it's clear we can't do anything significant by ourselves. We have to work with partners, whether it's other development organizations, the government, the private sector, and civil society. It's absolutely critical for the kinds of challenges we're facing today. On communications, it tends to be an afterthought. It tends to be about promoting your organization. But actually, I think we need to more and more change mindsets and beliefs about things. I wanted to give you an example. If we look at gender equality, for example, when I was in Serbia, I was particularly proud of a campaign that we ran called Tiče me se, which means it is my business, which is about smashing taboos around gender violence being a private issue. And this campaign came around during the 16 days of ending violence against women. But during the last year, when we ran this campaign, it took place very tragically when a girl blogger committed suicide. And she was a very famous in Serbia kind of social influencer, blogger, gamer. And she was practically the only woman girl in this field, which is very well male dominated. And so she was facing a lot of sort of harassment and shaming online. And in the end, she tragically committed suicide. But this came out during our campaign, and we used that campaign to really start the discussion in Serbia about, shaming and bullying and violence online. And because the campaign was really about outreach, we engaged with, influential men and boys, other, people, and it really had a big impact, that campaign, and it's something that I'm very proud of. And I mention that because, today we see, backsliding on women's rights, on gender equality in various countries around the world. And it's really important that we act. We've just recently come out with our gender equality strategy as UNDP, but addressing backsliding is a key component of it, and a big part of that is about monitoring the situation, understanding what's happening, but then doing that outreach and communications to challenge those kind of regressive attitudes. So comms would be my second. And then, as I said, innovation. When you go to countries like Indonesia and India, change is happening so fast. And as an office, you're just like running around. Yeah. And if you're not on top of the latest innovation, what role do you have in that country? So I think trying to be ahead of the curve especially in some of those middle income countries, but especially in Asia, which are developing so fast in terms of innovation, in terms of digital, is really, really important.
Do you think, and this might be a bit of a different question in terms of that is not exactly linked to a very direct challenge, but do you think as a woman working in the field and trying to push even certain messages or trying to conduct campaigns, as you were saying in the part where you were mentioning communication and the importance of communication, do you think that it was hard as a woman to make the message actually pass a bit better or easier? Were you challenged in that sense? Like, were there challenges, you think, linked to gender?
No,
No, you don't think
I
so?
think it's, as a woman, I get it. I understand it. I know what it's about. I know why it's important. It's personal as well as, work. So it means that you do it with extra passion,
Absolutely.
I remember at the time I started running, long distance running, and I ran my first half marathon in Serbia in Belgrade. But it was, for me, I was running for gender equality, so that personal sort of fight and challenge. I wanted to do it for women and raise awareness around the issue. So I think it makes it easier.
Absolutely. That's great. So then things that you think that actually worked in the field when you were in the field, and then things that did not, and how can we do better?
Mm.
So if you even have like practical examples, that'd be great.
Yeah. I think there's one key big challenge that we face when we're working in development in the field today. And that's just, the kinds of challenges that we face are so complex and so big, climate change, waste, pollution, um, migration. I mean, they're all such big, difficult issues to grapple with. It feels like the tools that we have as development organizations just aren't set up to address the kinds of challenges. So projects, tend to be very focused, um, using linear sort of ways of working, um, with a particular sort of defined objective in mind. I don't think that they're always the best tool to kind of try and tackle these issues. So I think the biggest challenge that I see is this very projectized way of working that affects us all. It affects us as development organizations. It affects development partners who contribute financing. It's the whole thing. So um, you know, I want to give an example of where we kind of tried to change that approach. And I would go back to Serbia again, and actually an initiative with the EU. We it's a it was a partnership, a contribution from the EU towards addressing the Green Deal, so promoting the Green Deal in Serbia, and it was a grant of about 10 million. But we worked on that in partnership with the European Investment Bank. So we came up with a joint proposal, and the idea behind the proposal was that we would, invest or spend that grant on pipeline initiatives that would support green transition. So, for example, money for startups who are trying to turn their business into more green business. And then once they had demonstrated that they were viable and worked and were green, the EIB would come in with investment money, with loan money to help scale up that work. And so for me, that partnership between UNDP and EIB, where there's grant money that's really leveraged for investment that becomes more sustainable, working with small scale private sector, was a really good thing. And then we wanted to create a platform. So it's not just the EU that came in. other donors liked the model. And so we got, several other donors come and say, we want to be part of this. So it went from being a project to more of a platform where different development partners came in, different investors could come in. So that's, I think, a different kind of model that moves us beyond this kind of aid and just grant funds. But since then, with that sort of experience in mind, we've been talking with DG NEAR about setting up a kind of pipeline facility for transformational initiatives in the green space in cities in this instance. And again, the idea is that there is a facility that basically sort of supports and promotes these initiatives that can potentially go to scale, where investment from banks or the private sector steps in once these initiatives are ready. But you design from the outset for scale, for transformation, and for investment by these financial institutions. So that, I think, is a model that's still very new, but we need to do much, much more like that.
That's great. Sounds great. I hope it works out. um, so, and then I guess the next question would be, what is your piece of advice to colleagues that work in the field and are, facing challenges every day that can be of varying degrees or can be different, of course. But what would your piece of advice be?
Yeah. Well, I now I'm based in New York, so my advice is go to the field. So I think it's really, really important if we work in development organizations to spend a lot of time in country offices in the field, because it's there that you really understand how change happens, how the role that we have as development organizations in promoting larger change, in transformational change. And, you know, once you spend time in the field, you understand that, a brilliant technical project, by itself is not going to create, you know, big change. You have to really understand, firstly, how decisions are made in a country is very, very complex. Um, Stefan Durkon, that I don't know if you saw his book, Gambling on Development, but he said, development change essentially happens when political and economic elites make deals.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some truth to that, but how decisions are made, how policymakers, how decision makers make those decisions is very complex. We recently came out just this week in the lead up to the SDG summit with an SDG Insights sort of global analysis that took 95 country reports, used AI to generate a sort of analysis of how countries are developing and meeting the SDGs. I mean, the overall prognosis is quite gloomy. The trajectory that countries are taking is still very carbon intensive. So fossil fuel driven, funded by debt. Poverty is not reducing. So it's a gloomy picture. But there are outliers. There are green shoots. There are signs of hope that are very significant. Leaders are making bold choices, and some of them are taking a different path, And so, how you work to help those leaders take those different paths is something that I think one is well suited to do when you work in the field, when you understand how those decisions are made. I mean, the other thing I would say is that, it's also important to, understand the role of digital today that can really accelerate and promote big change, we need to understand how, complex it is to address the sort of challenges facing governments today. It's not enough for many issues for single ministries to be working on issues. It really oftentimes requires a whole of government approach, maybe a whole of society approach where government is more of a curator, bringing different people on board, different parties on board to solve problems. So helping governments to work in these different kinds of ways to address complexity like we saw in COVID. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
this is the kind of role that we play now. And then, ultimately, we need to understand that development aid is changing and grant money in itself is playing an increasingly small role. And as I gave with the example of working with the IFIs, we need to look at investment and how we work with investment money, and how we address and work with trade, because these are the big influential factors over development today. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess going back to what you were saying at the beginning, one of the most important dimension is the dimension of partnerships as well, and just how do you see what's your, let's say, your hope for the future when it comes to intra and inter-organizational partnerships. So, for example, UNDP and the EU. So, what do you hope for the future for institutions like that?
I mean, my hope is that we um, move beyond a sort of donor-recipient relationship, a kind of contractual arrangement, to a true partnership, where our starting point, before we've really conceptualized what we want to do, the starting point is to talk to partners uh, about, what needs to be done, to have that trust exist, that our positions and our approaches are aligned, and that we're better off tackling this together. I mean, that's my hope, and that's in everything in everything that I do. I would like to approach issues that way. So bringing different parties, unusual partners around the table to really see what we can bring to an issue. So it's a bit of a shift. So instead of seeing ourselves as the expert and we have the solution, it's saying, this is a really difficult issue. I'm not sure how to do it.
So yes.
And we've got different experts who can understand different parts of it. But it's really important to have you around the table and you around the table and you around the table. And maybe we can find a way together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was absolutely great. Thank you so much for being with us today. And hopefully, this is not the last interview that we conduct together. Um, any other thing that you'd like to add, just to conclude?
Um, I think, for me, the partnership between UNDP and the EU is a really important one. That's why I'm here in Brussels today, this week. I think, we're coming up to the SDG summit and the UN General Assembly. And, there's a lot of work to do midpoint into the Agenda 2030. So we have to work together on the SDGs. We are coming up to 20 years of our partnership, and I think it's evolved and improved a lot in that time. I think we work together in over 100 countries around the world. I think my own experience is that we work together on really strategic issues. I mean, I mentioned the importance of financing and investment. One of the collaborations between UNDP and the EU is to work on these integrated national financing frameworks. This is when we go into countries and we work with the ministries of finance and with other partners to map all the flows of money going into and through that country. public, private, international, domestic. And we look with that country, what are the opportunities for nudging that investment so it's more aligned with SDGs? We know that there's more than enough money to achieve the SDGs. That's not the problem. The problem is, how do we make it about the SDGs? So, initiatives like that, we work on that in over 80 countries around the world. Apps, so it's app scale, are really important. I mean, if I also just mention briefly, one of the things we did here this week is we had an event with the EU uh, on nature. I think nature is fast becoming one of those issues as important as climate. I think, understandably, the world is focused on climate change, but increasingly we need to understand the impact we're having on nature, the bad impact we're having on nature, and how fundamental nature is to our lives. We can't keep seeing nature as separate or a trade-off to economic growth. So we had a really fascinating discussion co-hosted with the EU and UNEP yesterday to discuss these issues with a really great audience, and working together on supporting countries to implement their commitments to the biodiversity framework that was signed last year, or the way we work with the EU to support countries to implement their climate ambition, their nationally determined contributions that they've made to the COP in Glasgow about how they're going to address climate and the kind of action that they're going to take. We work with the EU to really support, more than 120 countries now on implementing that ambition. I mean, to me, these kinds of initiatives, we work with we have a project with you called FIOFIN, which is about raising finance to promote nature and biodiversity. I mean, these are very strategic, very, contemporary issues, and this partnership is, really important to taking it forward.